In the spring of 1916, in the quiet town of Bielotserkva in the Russian Empire, a girl named Lyudmila Mikhailivna Pavlichenko was born. Her family lived modestly. Her father worked as a mechanic, and her mother was a teacher. They believed in discipline, in education, and in the duty to serve one's country. Lyudmila grew up surrounded by these values, and they would define her life in ways no one could foresee. When she was a child, she loved to compete with boys in her neighborhood, proving she could run faster, climb higher, and shoot straighter. She was stubborn and proud. In school, she was serious, but it was the open air that called to her more than books. She joined a local shooting club as a teenager, inspired by the Soviet Union's emphasis on military preparedness. It was there that her steady hands, calm mind, and precise eye became noticed. She learned that patience, not speed, made a good marksman. In the late 1932, she enrolled at Kyiv University to study history. She wanted a quiet academic life, to study the past rather than create it. But history had other plans. Europe was on fire, and the shadow of war grew closer every month. The Soviet Union, still recovering from the purges and the scars of collectivization, was unprepared for what was coming. Yet the propaganda of the time painted a picture of unity, of strength, and of unbreakable resolve. Lyudmila's life changed forever in June 1941. The German invasion of the Soviet Union, Operation Barbarossa, began. It was a shock that shattered illusions across the country. Kiev was bombed. Millions were mobilized. At the recruiting offices, crowds formed, demanding to serve. Among them was Lyudmila. When she tried to enlist, officials suggested she become a nurse. It was the usual role assigned to women, but she insisted on joining as a soldier. When she presented her sharpshooting certificates, the recruiters hesitated, then reluctantly agreed. She was accepted into the Red Army's 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. She received her rifle, a Mosin Nagant, with a simple scope. It was not much, but in her hands, it became a deadly instrument of precision. She was 24 years old, inexperienced in war but determined. Her academic ambitions faded behind her uniform and rifle. She left Kyiv with her unit, heading toward the front near Odessa. The air smelled of dust and fuel, and the sounds of war grew louder each day. The Soviet lines were disorganized, the enemy fast and relentless. For Lyudmila, it was the beginning of a transformation from student to soldier, from daughter to defender. The road ahead would be long and merciless, but she was ready to walk it. The summer of 1941 was brutal for the Red Army. The German advance was rapid and merciless. Cities fell one after another, and chaos spread along the front lines. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko and the 25th Rifle Division reached the outskirts of Odessa, the young sniper faced the true face of war for the first time. The heat was suffocating, the ground dry and cracked, and the constant roar of artillery filled the sky. Her first days were spent in trenches and foxholes, watching and waiting. She studied the terrain through her scope, learning to read every shadow, every flicker of movement. The enemy was cunning, skilled, and equipped with better weapons. But she had something that could not be measured in steel patience and composure. Her first confirmed kill came unexpectedly. A German scout appeared on a ridge, unaware of her presence. Lyudmila's finger hesitated for a fraction of a second. She had trained to shoot targets, not men. But then the scout raised his binoculars, searching for Soviet positions. She exhaled slowly and pulled the trigger. The sound was sharp, brief, and final. The man collapsed. It was the moment she crossed the invisible line between peace and war. There was no celebration, only silence. She wrote nothing about it, spoke nothing. In her mind, she accepted what she had become: a soldier, a sniper, a tool of survival. The Odessa defense dragged on for weeks. The Germans and their Romanian allies launched constant assaults. The 25th Division held the line against overwhelming odds. Snipers became vital to the defense, disrupting enemy advances and sowing confusion. Lyudmila's skill grew with each engagement. She learned to move unseen, to change positions before counterfire, to use the environment to her advantage. Her kills increased rapidly. Each shot was a calculation: wind, distance, breath, heartbeat. Her rifle became an extension of her body. She began to feel the strange detachment that only snipers understood: the separation between action and emotion. When Odessa finally had to be evacuated in October 1941, Lyudmila had already achieved dozens of confirmed kills. The retreat was chaotic. Soldiers packed into ships bound for Sevastopol, carrying what little equipment they could. Odessa fell, but for Lyudmila and her comrades, the fight was far from over. In Sevastopol, the war took on a different character. The terrain was rocky, the air heavy with salt, the enemy relentless. The defenders were determined to hold the city at all costs. Lyudmila was no longer a novice. She was now an experienced sniper, respected and feared. Her commanders began to assign her more dangerous missions: reconnaissance, counter-sniper operations, the elimination of enemy officers. Each day she wrote down the number of confirmed kills in her logbook. It was not pride that drove her. It was duty. The Germans called her the unseen death, a whisper that spread among their ranks. The Red Army called her a hero. But to Lyudmila, she was simply doing her part in a war that demanded everything. By late 1941, Sevastopol had become a fortress. It was one of the last strongholds in southern Ukraine, surrounded by cliffs and the Black Sea. The Soviet Navy, retreating from the disasters of the early war, made the port a symbol of resistance. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived there with the 25th Rifle Division, she entered a world where survival depended on endurance and precision. The siege began with relentless bombing. German dive bombers screamed through the sky daily, their payloads turning earth and stone into dust. The defenders dug into the hillsides, carving firing positions from rock. Snipers became the eyes of the army, mapping enemy movements, spotting artillery targets, and striking with deadly accuracy. Lyudmila operated in the northern sector, where the fighting was constant. She spent hours lying motionless under camouflage nets, her rifle aimed across the ravines. Each morning, she checked her rifle, cleaned the scope, and prepared for the day's work. Her partner, a spotter, scanned with binoculars, noting wind direction and sun glare. It was a cold, mechanical rhythm that left no space for fear. German soldiers quickly learned to fear the silent shot that came from nowhere. They began to give her a name: Frau Todd, the Lady of Death. Soviet propaganda would later transform it into Lady Death, a title that followed her forever. She did not seek fame, but in the brutal efficiency of her work, she became a legend. As weeks turned to months, conditions in Sevastopol worsened. Food was scarce, water rationed, and the wounded filled underground hospitals. Yet morale held. The city's defenders fought with desperation, turning ruins into fortresses. Lyudmila continued her missions without pause. Her confirmed kills surpassed 100, then 200. Commanders cited her as an example of discipline and courage. She took part in counter-sniper duels, some lasting days. German sharpshooters were skilled, and the duels were games of patience. She would wait motionless for hours, searching for the faintest reflection from a scope. When she fired, it was precise and final. These encounters tested her nerves more than anything else in the war. Winter brought freezing winds and snow that covered the ground like a shroud. The cold made metal brittle and fingers numb, yet she continued. She learned to fire between heartbeats, her breath controlled even in sub-zero temperatures. Her kill count reached over 300, and her name became synonymous with Soviet resistance. The defenders of Sevastopol knew the end was coming. Supplies were dwindling, reinforcements impossible. Still, they refused to surrender. For Lyudmila, every mission became an act of defiance. Each shot carried the weight of comrades lost, of cities destroyed, of a country fighting for its life. By the spring of 1942, the siege tightened. The Germans launched a final assault with overwhelming force. Lyudmila's division was ordered to hold its sector to the last man. The city that had once echoed with gunfire and courage was slowly consumed by fire and smoke. Amid the chaos, Lyudmila was wounded by mortar fragments. It was not the first time she had been injured, but this wound was serious. She was evacuated by sea under heavy bombardment. As she was carried away from the city, she watched Sevastopol burning in the distance. For her, it was not defeat, but a promise that she would continue to fight in any way she could. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko arrived in the Caucasus after her evacuation from Sevastopol, she was physically weak but mentally unbroken. Her wounds healed slowly, yet her spirit remained intact. She had become a symbol, though she never asked for it. The Soviet command recognized the power of her story. A young woman, a student-turned-sniper, with hundreds of confirmed kills, she embodied resilience and defiance. Her official count at that time exceeded 300 enemy soldiers, including dozens of snipers and officers. Propaganda units began to circulate her name throughout the front lines. Posters and newspapers described her as Lady Death, a title meant to inspire soldiers and terrify the enemy. To the German army, she was now a known adversary, mentioned in radio transmissions and intelligence reports. Some snipers were said to have been sent specifically to eliminate her. Lyudmila's reputation brought both admiration and isolation. Within her unit, she was respected but also distant. War had taken something from her that words could not replace. The faces of fallen comrades, the destroyed cities, the endless fatigue, all of it hardened her. Yet beneath the discipline remained the memory of the young student from Kiev, the one who once dreamed of history books instead of battlefields. The Soviet leadership decided that her presence would serve a greater purpose beyond the front lines. She was too valuable to risk losing. In mid-1942, she was withdrawn from active combat. It was a strange moment for her. After months of fighting, the silence felt heavier than artillery. She had lived by the rifle, and now she was told to put it down. Instead of the battlefield, she entered the world of politics and propaganda. She was sent to Moscow and later across the ocean to represent the Soviet Union among its Western allies. The purpose was clear: to humanize the Soviet struggle, to show that the USSR was not only an army, but a nation of ordinary people who fought with courage. In 1942, she traveled to the United States and Canada as part of a Soviet delegation. For the first time, she saw a world untouched by war's destruction. Streets were whole, buildings stood unscarred, and people spoke of the war as something distant. Her presence drew enormous attention. The press called her the girl sniper, the woman who killed hundreds of Nazis. Crowds came to see her, expecting a symbol of vengeance. But she was quiet, calm, and precise in her words. She met President Franklin Roosevelt and First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who became deeply impressed by her. The First Lady later invited her to tour American cities to speak directly to the public. In her speeches, Lyudmila did not dramatize. She spoke of endurance, of the price of freedom, of the blood being shed daily on Soviet soil. Her voice was steady, and her message was clear. The war was not distant, and the Allies must act. Her uniform, adorned with medals, contrasted sharply with the glamorous world of diplomacy. Reporters often focused on her youth, her appearance, or her accent. Yet behind the photographs and headlines stood a soldier who had lived through horror. She was not a celebrity. She was a survivor. The legend of Lady Death continued to grow, but Lyudmila saw it differently. The fame was not her own, it belonged to every soldier who had fallen, to every defender of Sevastopol, to every unknown face who stood their ground. She carried that burden quietly, as another kind of battle, fought not with bullets, but with words and memory. The journey across the Atlantic marked a new phase in Lyudmila Pavlichenko's war, not one of bullets and trenches, but of speeches and diplomacy. The ship that carried her and the Soviet delegation moved through guarded waters, escorted against the threat of German submarines. For Lyudmila, the endless sea felt foreign. She had spent months on the front line, surrounded by the sound of artillery and the closeness of comrades. Now there was silence, broken only by the hum of engines and the rush of wind. When she stepped onto American soil, reporters surrounded her immediately. They had read about her exploits, the Soviet sniper who had killed over 300 enemy soldiers, the young woman whom the Germans called Lady Death. Cameras flashed as she stood in her olive green uniform, her face calm, her posture rigid with military precision. For the American public, she was both a curiosity and a symbol of something distant but powerful. The Eastern Front, where millions were fighting and dying in a struggle most of them could barely imagine. Her first meetings were formal. She was received in Washington, where she met President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He asked her about the conditions of the front, the morale of Soviet troops, the weapons they used. She answered simply and factually, without embellishment. She spoke of the bombings, the hunger, the cold, and the determination that kept her comrades fighting. The president listened in silence, aware that the war she described was unlike anything America had yet experienced. It was the First Lady, Eleanor Roosevelt, who saw beyond the military uniform. She recognized in Lyudmila a rare combination of strength and quiet dignity. They formed an unexpected friendship. Eleanor invited her to tour the United States, to speak directly to the people about what was happening on Soviet soil. For Lyudmila, it was a new battlefield, one of words, where her weapon was truth. She traveled through dozens of cities, Chicago, New York, Washington, Ottawa. Crowds filled halls and theaters to hear her speak. Sometimes the questions were naive, focused on her gender rather than her experience. Reporters would ask if she wore makeup at the front, or if women could truly fight like men. She answered with restraint, reminding them that on the battlefield there was no difference. The only thing that mattered was skill and courage. Her speeches grew in confidence. She spoke not for herself, but for her country. She described the defense of Odessa and Sevastopol, the lives lost, the cities turned to ash. Her tone was not emotional, but her words carried weight. In one of her most famous addresses, she challenged the audience directly, asking when the Western Allies would open a second front in Europe. The question echoed through newspapers and radio broadcasts. It was a reminder that while America debated, Soviet soldiers continued to die every day. In Canada, she received a warm welcome from officials and veterans. She met women who worked in factories producing munitions and aircraft. She told them that their work was as vital as any soldier's. Her sincerity inspired many, and for a brief moment, she bridged two distant worlds, the peaceful safety of North America and the burning fields of the Eastern Front. By the end of her tour, she was exhausted but fulfilled. She had carried her message across an ocean, turning her personal story into a symbol of collective endurance. The legend of Lady Death had grown far beyond the battlefield, but at its core remained a single truth. She had fought not for fame, but for survival, and for the memory of those who could no longer speak. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko returned to the Soviet Union in late 1942, the war had reached its darkest stage. Entire regions lay in ruins, and millions were dead or displaced. The great cities of the West, Kyiv, Kharkiv, Smolensk, had been reduced to rubble. The Red Army was still fighting desperately, but a new sense of resolve had taken hold. The turning point was near, though few yet believed it. Lyudmila's homecoming was quiet. She had been away from the front for months, speaking to audiences who would never see what war truly meant. Now, as the train carried her through endless plains, scarred by shell craters and burnt villages, she saw again the reality behind her speeches. The war was not a story of heroes and victories. It was a story of endurance. Her wounds still troubled her. The shrapnel scars from Sevastopol ached in cold weather, and fatigue haunted her body. Yet she requested to return to duty. The command refused. She was too valuable as a public figure, a living symbol. They assigned her instead to training new snipers, young men and women barely out of school, who would soon take her place at the front. At the training camps, she spoke little. Her presence alone carried authority. Recruits listened in silence as she explained the discipline of patience, the art of concealment, the need to separate emotion from action. She told them that every bullet must be deliberate, every movement measured. She taught them that a sniper's strength lay not in aggression, but in control. Many of her students would not survive their first months of combat. She knew it, and they knew it. But she also knew that without them, the Soviet lines would crumble. Her lessons became a kind of legacy, an effort to pass on the knowledge that had kept her alive. As the Red Army began to push the Germans back after the victory at Stalingrad, news of progress spread through the ranks. The tide had finally turned. Lyudmila continued to train soldiers, her name now mentioned in textbooks and broadcasts. The government awarded her the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, the nation's highest honor. The medal glimmered on her uniform, but for her it symbolized not triumph, but loss. She often thought of the faces from Sevastopol, the comrades who never made it out, the men and women buried beneath the shattered city. Their memory followed her everywhere, in dreams and in silence. Sometimes, while demonstrating rifle technique, she would pause briefly, her gaze distant. Then she would continue, her voice steady, her expression unreadable. Outside the barracks, the Soviet propaganda machine continued to build her image. Posters displayed her calm face beneath the headline Lady Death, and school children learned her name. Yet in private, she remained withdrawn. Fame had become a burden she carried quietly, like an invisible wound. As 1,943 turned to 1,944, the front lines moved westward. The Red Army was advancing, reclaiming the lands that had been lost. The war was far from over. But for Lyudmila Pavlichenko, her own combat days were behind her. She had given everything she could to the struggle. Now, her role was to prepare others for the fight she could no longer join. When the war finally ended in 1945, the Soviet Union was a land of ruins and victory. The cost had been beyond measure. Cities burned, families scattered, and millions of graves stretched across its vast territories. For Lyudmila Pavlichenko, the sound of the final guns brought not joy, but exhaustion. She had survived what so many had not. The silence that followed was heavier than battle itself. Her wartime records listed 309 confirmed kills, a number that made her one of the deadliest snipers in history. But numbers were abstractions. Each one, she knew, represented a life taken, a moment she could never erase. The medals and titles Hero of the Soviet Union, Order of Lenin, and countless commendations were given to her with ceremony, yet she accepted them with quiet detachment. The celebrations could not erase the memories of Odessa, Sevastopol, and the endless waiting between shots. After the war, she returned to Kyiv. The university she once attended was scarred but still standing. The history department reopened, and she resumed her studies, determined to complete what she had begun before the invasion. For her, returning to the study of the past was a way to reclaim her identity. Yet she found that history looked different now. The world she had lived through could not fit neatly into textbooks or lectures. It was written in ashes, in names carved on memorial stones, in faces she could no longer recall clearly. She began working as a historian and later as an officer in the Soviet Navy, holding administrative positions. Her public life continued. She attended parades, gave speeches, and appeared at military academies. Younger soldiers looked at her with reverence, seeing in her the embodiment of duty and courage. But she rarely spoke of her wartime experiences. When she did, her words were measured and factual, never glorified. She believed that truth was enough. The years passed, and the legend of Lady Death grew, even as the woman behind it withdrew into privacy. She struggled with health problems caused by her injuries and by the strain of combat. The nightmares never left her. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could still feel the weight of the rifle in her hands, the cold of the Sevastopol cliffs, the distant echo of artillery. In moments of reflection, she thought of those who had trained under her, the young snipers who had gone to fight after her. Many never returned. Yet she took solace in knowing that her knowledge had helped them fight more effectively, that her experience had not been in vain. As the Soviet Union entered the years of reconstruction, her story became part of the state's mythology. She appeared in documentaries, her image printed in textbooks and displayed in museums. But she knew that the true story of war could never be fully told in propaganda. It was not a tale of glory, but of endurance and loss. In her later writings, she emphasized the importance of remembrance. She urged that the world should not forget what war costs, and that peace was something to be guarded with vigilance. The war had given her fame, but it had taken her youth, her health, and her innocence. She carried that understanding quietly until the end of her life. By the time she retired, Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become more than a soldier. She was a witness to the resilience of her people, to the cruelty of conflict, and to the fragile strength of those who survived. The war had ended, but its shadow would always remain within her, as silent and precise as the aim of her rifle once had been. In the decades that followed the end of the war, the name Lyudmila Pavlichenko remained woven into the memory of a nation. Her story was told in schools, printed in newspapers, and repeated on anniversaries of victory. Yet behind the public image, she lived a quiet life, carrying the invisible weight of everything she had seen. The war had made her a symbol, but symbols do not sleep easily. She continued her work as a historian, documenting events that she herself had shaped. Her lectures were factual and restrained, never glorifying the past. Students often expected heroic tales, but she spoke instead about endurance, about the necessity of understanding the real cost of victory. She believed that history should teach caution, not pride. In official ceremonies, she stood among generals and decorated veterans, her uniform still immaculate, her expression calm. Journalists sometimes asked if she regretted her actions or if she missed the battlefield. She answered without hesitation that she had done what duty required. The question of regret was one she kept for herself. To her, the war had not been a matter of choice. It was survival for her comrades, for her homeland. She aged quietly. The once fierce sniper became a reserved woman, her body weakened by old wounds and the years of stress that never fully left her. Still, her eyes retained the sharpness of the soldier who once lay in the dust of Sevastopol with her finger steady on the trigger. She rarely spoke of those days, but when she did, her words carried the clarity of truth stripped of emotion. In 1957, she attended international peace conferences, advocating for disarmament and cooperation. The irony was not lost on her. The woman once known as Lady Death now spoke for peace. But it was a transformation that made sense to her. No one understood the cost of war better than those who had lived it most directly. Her message was simple. The absence of war was not weakness, but strength, earned through suffering. She lived to see a new generation grow up in a world that remembered the war only through books and monuments. To them, her name was legend, a story of courage told at parades. Few could imagine the human behind the myth, the young woman who once dreamed of studying history, who became its subject instead. In 1974, Lyudmila Pavlichenko passed away in Moscow at the age of 58. Her funeral was attended by veterans, students, and officials. The military honors were solemn, the speeches respectful. Yet the truest tribute was the silence that followed, the same silence she had known on the battlefield after each shot, when only the wind and the earth remained to bear witness. Today, her story endures not as propaganda, but as a record of endurance. She stands among the many who bore the unbearable, a reminder that heroism often comes not from triumph, but from persistence. The title Lady Death, once meant to strike fear, has become a mark of respect not for the taking of life, but for the strength to protect it in humanity's darkest hours. Lyudmila Pavlichenko's life was a testament to the complex nature of courage. She was both soldier and scholar, killer and teacher, a woman shaped by the harshest demands of her time. She did not seek glory, but duty found her, and through it, she became part of history. Long after her rifle was laid to rest, her name remained written not just in military records, but in the enduring memory of a people who survived. In that memory, she lives silent, steady, and eternal, like the mark of a single perfect shot across the span of history.